another round of violence and escalation. EU calls on Houthis to revoke death penalty of 4 journalists detained in Houthi jails. On World Mental Health Day, Yemenis across the country continue to suffer from the scars and atrocities of the war. Welcome to Yemen Today TV. This is the English News with me, Shaza Abdelbey. The failure to extend the UN truce puts danger to push Yemen into another chapter of violence and military escalation. According to some observers, such threats would not only destabilize Yemen, but also the entire region. This report has more details.
After a 6-month truce, the Yemeni government and the Houthi militia failed to extend the nationwide ceasefire. The current situation might well lead Yemen towards another chapter of violent escalation within its protracted civil war, an escalation that cannot be viewed in isolation from the surrounding regional developments. The failure in reviving the nuclear deal with Iran and the recent ongoing waves of instability in Iran will definitely impact the region. The Gulf countries, mainly KSA and the UAE, might become again the target of Houthi rockets, which in turn will affect dramatically the prices of energy at a very critical moment with the whole sector of global energy going through difficult times. The failure in renewing the truce will rapidly increase tension and push both parties to adopt escalatory approach with higher tendency to use power in a very evident way. This, unfortunately, will not just widen the area of conflict, it also will risk further instability in the region. But it might also pave the way for criminal and terrorist groups to re-emerge and benefit from the escalation, especially Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, that will definitely take advantage of the conflict and declare its return. The failure to save the truce in Yemen will add more gravity to the humanitarian situation in Yemen, with millions are prospecting peace to secure their daily living. Others, especially vulnerable groups such as children, women and patients, will have the biggest share in bearing the brunt of any new military escalation.
The European Union mission to Yemen called on the Iran-backed Houthi militia to stop the death penalty against 4 journalists who have been detained in Houthi jails since 2015. Such a call comes on the World Day Against Death Penalty. This report has more details.
Groups have asked Yemen's Houthi rebels to release 4 journalists convicted to death for espionage in the war-torn nation. The Houthis, backed by Iran, took over Sana'a from the government in 2014, igniting a civil war that has destroyed the already destitute country. In 2015, a group of 10 journalists were abducted by the Houthis during a raid in the capital Sana'a. The Houthis sentenced the journalists to death for their alleged cooperation with the coalition. During a prisoner swap between the Houthis and the government in 2020, 6 journalists were released while the remaining journalists were sentenced to death on allegations of treason and espionage, a verdict the Yemen's government opposed at the time. The journalists were reportedly thrown into solitary confinement, denied life-saving medical treatment, and banned from contacting their families. The International Federation of Journalists and the Yemeni Journalist Syndicate said that their arrest was motivated by the reporting on human rights violations committed by Houthi forces. The 2 groups announced they were hosting an emergency call to exert pressure on the Houthi leadership to liberate the journalists and preserve their lives. The International Federation of Journalists, which stands for the journalists and unions of over 140 countries, said the 4 captured journalists had suffered physical and psychological torture, and the denial of their right to be visited and the right to have access to medical care. The European Union mission to Yemen called on the Iranian-backed Houthi militia to stop the unjust death sentences against the 4 journalists. According to human rights reports, since 2015, the Houthi militia has committed more than 1,450 violations, including 51 killings of journalists and more than 350 kidnappings. Hundreds of thousands have been murdered and millions have been displaced as a result of Yemen's conflict, which the UN has termed the world's greatest humanitarian crisis.
2 civilians were killed and 2 others were injured due to mines explosion in Sana'a and Hudaydah. The Houthi militia suffered heavy losses in Al-Dala. Military sources reported that the government forces stopped a Houthi attack in Al-Dala, killing a number of Houthis and inflicting heavy losses in lives and equipment. Government forces announced that they had stopped 2 infiltration attempts by the Houthi militia south and west of Taz. The media center of Taz stated that the forces stopped an infiltration attempt on Al-Hatub front on the outskirts of Jabal Habshi, west of Taz. Another Houthi attack was also deterred on Al-Aqrut front south of the city. Death, destruction, homelessness, and displacement are not the only things left by the war in Yemen. The war has also caused mental illness. While the world marks Mental Health Day, Yemenis continue to bear the scars of the war. This report has more details.
According to the UN Refugee Agency, 1 in every 5 war survivors suffers from mental health challenges. Living in a conflict zone means being subjected to continual stress for extended periods of time. Yemen's armed war has had a negative impact on people's physical health and their access to healthcare, education, and food. It has also restricted their freedom of movement and denied them the right to express themselves. These factors have severely impacted the survivors' mental health. Under the slogan Mental Health and Well-Being for All, the Center for Strategic Studies to Support Women and Children held its second conference on mental health, coinciding with the World Mental Health Day.
Today in World Mental Health Day, the Center for Strategic Studies holds its second successive conference to celebrate this occasion and retreat our support for research efforts made by all staff and specialists in the mental health field. We also hope to establish a national strategy that can equitably benefit all segments of the nation.
The conference examined several research papers surrounding the importance of mental health during the time of war, addiction risk in youths, violence against women, and the underlying roots of child labor within the country. The World Health Organization found that an estimated 19.5% of the population of Yemen, particularly children, suffer from mental disorders. Yemen, a country on the verge of infrastructural collapse, economic instability, and a disintegrating healthcare system, needs global assistance to ensure the mental health of its children. Mental health should not be forgotten, however, it is neglected and underfunded by the government and humanitarian organizations. After more than 8 years of persistent conflict, indiscriminate attacks, airstrikes, torture, famine, unemployment, and pandemics have severely weakened the people's resilience, with the percentage of the post-conflict population facing physical and mental struggles that linger long after the last bullet has been fired.
Interior Minister Ibrahim Haidan discussed in Riyadh with the security diplomat of the U.S. Embassy in Yemen the joint cooperation in the field of fighting terrorism. In addition, the Minister of Interior reviewed the security situation in the liberated governorates and the Houthi violations and crimes. The British Royal Navy seized drugs worth more than £50 million from a boat in the Arabian Sea. The forces found hundreds of kilograms of crystal meth in a 6-hour operation carried out by their crew. The International Organization for Migration warned that more than 6 million students are suffering from the collapse of the educational system in Yemen. In addition, the IOM called on donors to provide more support to the country, indicating that it has built and rehabilitated 33 schools in 4 Yemeni governorates. In Taz, hundreds of citizens protested against a continued power outage and interruption of salaries. Protesters asked the government and the local authority to restore electricity in Taz, which has been living in complete darkness for 8 years, in addition to paying the salaries of electricity employees.
Today, we denounce the deteriorating situation in the governorate. Corruption has reached unprecedented levels. We in Taiz have lived in total darkness for 8 years. The problem is that the government has rented the power generation network to traders. Electricity is far from accessible to the poor. The network is operated by the war traders. Thousands of documents prove that the government has sold the facility to the war traders and the citizen is living in darkness, such as the case in the pre-industrial area. This only happens in Taiz.
Coming next in the news. The historic ancient Yemeni coffee is reclaimed in the cafes of the United States. Welcome back. The 8-year conflict has caused endless suffering of Yemenis. People in Al-Farsi village in Aden live in dire humanitarian situation and suffer from illness and poverty. This report has more details.
Diseases and hardships of life afflicted the residents of Al-Farsi area in Al-Barika district west of the city of Aden, imposing a double tragedy on dozens of families. Ismail al-Jamma'i, a resident of the area, suffers from the pain of his 2 daughters, one of whom is paralyzed and can't move, and the other has a heart disease, and his conditions do not allow him to afford or provide treatment for them.
I've got 2 daughters. Both of them are sick. One has a brain atrophy and the other is suffering from a heart disease. I went to Egypt and the doctors there said she should have a surgery, which requires a lot of money that I don't have. So we came back to Yemen. I'm calling on the humanitarian organizations to provide some help to my little daughter.
Not far from Jamma'i's house, there is a grieving mother with her 3 children, suffering from brain and mental diseases, and their demands apply an extra burden on her.
My 3 children have brain atrophy. Shadia's case is the worst. She is paralyzed and she can't move at all. She requires health care and a lot of money for her treatment. She needs to have a knee surgery, but I can't afford it. The 3 of them are on medication for their brain disease. Every 15 days, I have to buy new medicines and diapers. The single package is for 14,000 riyal. I can't afford all this. If they miss the dose, they get seizures and their case worsens even more. We are doing a research here in the area. We found many families that are in severe need of assistance. Children who are paralyzed and have different kinds of disabilities, and even elders.
These cases are just examples of tens or even hundreds of families here in Al-Farsi area who have been swept by poverty and are continuously suffering from different diseases. Needy families do not ask people promptly. They need the attention of the government and organizations working in the humanitarian field to help them and provide them with assistance to overcome their suffering imposed by the harsh living conditions.
The United Nations Office for Humanitarian Affairs in Yemen has issued a new warning that 20 new health facilities could be closed due to lack of funding. The office said that the closure will deprive 800,000 women and girls from healthcare services, as well as the spread of polio, cholera, measles, and dengue fever. The Yemeni Network for Rights and Freedom recorded more than 5,000 violations against health facilities in Yemen from 2018 up to this year. The network stated in a report that the violations included direct killing of medical staff, enforced disappearance, shelling of medical facilities, selling medicines in black market, and depriving civilians of them.
The fisheries sector in Yemen plays a crucial role in providing food and essential nutrients to over 100,000 families in the coastal areas of Yemen. But fishing is not always an easy job for the fishers that you see here behind me. The fishing livelihoods have been affected a lot by the conflict that has marred this country for nearly 7 years. A lot of infrastructure has been destroyed. Fishing boats, ports and other port infrastructure has been destroyed, and many fishers have lost their lives.
The Yemeni government is considering to stop the export of fish, given the country's need for food security. The Yemeni government had taken a decision to prevent the export of agricultural products after the outbreak of the war between Russia and Ukraine. Yemen suffers from a wide imbalance in the trade balance between fish exports and agricultural products in favor of imports at a rate of more than 80%. A recent study warned that the threat of SAFER can damage the fisheries sector in Yemen and the entire region. This report has more details.
Before the war broke out in 2014, Yemen's fishing industry played an important part of its economy and in the lives of its people, employing more than 500,000 people in fishing and fishing-related activities, upon whom 1.7 million people, representing 18% of the coastal community's population, relied on it for their livelihoods. It was Yemen's second biggest export after oil and gas. Total fisheries production came to about 200,000 tons per year, 40 to 50% of which went for export, generating $300 million in annual revenue. Yemen's fishing industry is dominated by small-scale operations, employing over 80,000 small-scale fishermen and contributing towards over 90% of total production, utilizing either small boats with an outboard motor and crew of 2 to 6, or larger wooden boats with either an outboard or inboard motor and crew of 10 to 25 plus, who operate seasonally due to the prevalence of winter and summer monsoons. Small boats had always been used for fishing close to the coast within 40 kilometers. But due to higher operating costs such as fuel and lower fish stocks from overfishing, they began to travel further out and stay out longer, up to 10 days. However, larger boats are used for longer journeys and travel times, which last from a few days to a few weeks. Since the outbreak of hostilities, the fishing industry has been severely impacted, according to a Norwegian Refugee Council report in August 2019. Nearly a third of agricultural production and fishing had disappeared. The cost of the fishing sector as a result of damage to harbors, landing centers, and boats had been nearly $7 billion. 2 fishing depots and 35 boats were reported damaged or destroyed by airstrikes, shelling, and sea mines. And at least 334 fishermen have been reported killed or injured since 2015. Prior to the recently 6-month truce between the Saudi-led coalition and the Houthis, the former had imposed a blockade on the port of Hodeidah to contain the Iranian-backed Houthis, who still hold control of the strategic Red Sea port, including tight restrictions on where and how far local fishermen could go and fish off the coast. Such restrictions are done to protect themselves from arms smuggling and attacks. There have been numerous and continual instances of deadly direct and indirect firepower reportedly directed at fishermen from both air and the sea. These dangers, as well as those which come from mines being planted out in the sea, have understandably increased the price of fish, already heightened due to the scarcity of fuel.
Yemeni coffee is the oldest cultivated in the world. Recently, a number of Yemeni cafes has opened in different states in America. This report has more details.
Suma's Della's Coffee House is a place which is built on Yemeni style, vibe, and design to bring the aroma of the Yemeni coffee to the city of San Francisco. The shop aims to bring Yemeni coffee culture across the borders and indulge in the western cities. The name is in reference to the traditional coffee pot, Adalla, and the walls are decorated with maps that explain the history of coffee and its significance to Yemen. And now, Omar Jihami, the owner of the coffee house, has confirmed his plans to open a second location of his Yemeni-style coffee house in Uptown Oakland, to broaden his business and to educate people about Yemeni culture and heritage. Della Coffee House was the first Bay Area cafe to highlight coffee's geographical origins in both the design of the shop, and its menu. When people come to this place to order a cup of coffee at their table, the drink arrives in a pot, known as the dalla, with candles lit underneath to keep it hot, which is the way it is presented in Yemen, to give the customers the full experience of Yemen's customs and traditions. The seating in this place will look a little bit different too, as the hope in this location is to offer more family-friendly seating, like the traditional Yemeni sofas. As Jihami said, sofas are common in cafes back home. Plenty of third-wave shops incorporate farmers' stories from throughout the coffee belt. But coffee was born along the Gulf of Aden, and coffee beans were first cultivated and produced commercially in the northern African country, as Yemen was the first country to commercially export coffee throughout its port of Mecca, honoring North Africa's importance in coffee's history, and it is often relegated to the coffee bag alone. As the young business keeps growing, Jihami hopes its fan base continue to swell, and that more and more locations can grow up throughout the Bay Area and the state.
Here's a reminder of the main headlines. Failure to extend the truce can push Yemen into another round of violence and escalation. EU calls on Houthis to revoke death penalty of 4 journalists detained in Houthi jails. On World Mental Health Day, Yemenis across the country continue to suffer from the scars and atrocities of the war. This is the end of the news. Thank you for watching.